Hello, and thank you for joining us for this webcast on the digital health revolution, business trends, regulations, and more. My name is Lucy Ellis, Executive Editor of Invivo, and I'll be your moderator today. For the webinar, I'll be joined by Derek Gingery, Senior Writer for Pink Sheet, Zach Rothstein, Vice President of Technology and Regulatory Affairs at AdvaMed, and Ferdas Farouk, who also goes by Danny, and he's a Senior Reporter at MedTech Insights. Together, they'll be taking you through the following agenda, looking at the role of real-world evidence in relation to digital health, artificial intelligence and cybersecurity challenges, and an overview of the pharma and medtech regulatory landscape in relation to digital technology. There will also be a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so if you have any questions, we want to hear from you. We'll be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session, and if there are any extra questions, we will follow up after the webcast by email. Because we know you'll want to listen to this webinar again, today's session is being recorded, and it will be available to all who have registered for the webinar. To get us started, I will first give a brief introduction into the digital health space today. It is apparent that traditional models for pharma and medtech firms need a reboot. Companies are regularly highlighting the need to fill pipelines and grow their businesses outside of annual product price increases. Over the last 3 years, more and more deals have emerged that centre on partnerships, licensing and agreements, and acquisitions for digital health companies. To date, though, alliances between more traditional businesses and digital health companies have been more commonplace than M&A. Taking just the biopharma sector as an example, 3 frequent deal types have emerged over the last few years. These are centred on AI for drug discovery, app development, and digital therapeutics. On the slide on screen now, you'll see a selection of key digital health deals that we've seen between 2017 and 2019. In 2017, Sanofi and Accenture teamed up for the discovery of new bispecific small molecules for metabolic conditions, while in 2018, Propeller Health and Aptar signed an agreement to co-develop and co-market digital medicines across multiple disease areas. And just earlier this year, Novartis and Otsuka both spent out on deals for mobile app-based technologies. And these are just a small selection of deals we've seen in this space over the last couple of years. Another key indicator of pharma and medtech's focus on the digital space is the increase in appointments in this area. Since 2016, several large pharma and medtech companies have appointed chief digital and chief information officers. Some companies have promoted leaders in this space from other roles in the business, while others have made new introductions to their executive teams. In June 2016, Lilly promoted Arti Shah to Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer, while in 2017, GSK appointed its first Chief Digital and Information Officer in the form of Karen Terrell. And interestingly, Sanofi has this year named Amit Nathwani its Chief Digital and Chief Medical Officer in a combined role, signalling where the big pharma is looking to focus its digital transformation. Elsewhere, several medtech firms have also made appointments in this space and named new heads of digital, with Wright Medical and Ottobock as examples. Here you can see them all placed on a timeline from 2016 to 2019 as some key appointments in the area. Some of the benefits already being noticed by companies exploring deals with digital health firms include being able to speed up their route to market, reducing their workforce where automation is possible, reducing costs where digital maintenance and manufacturing applications can be used, better use of existing data and improved data collection and analysis tools. Also, we're seeing that the use of digital tools across the discovery and development spectrum can allow for companies to reject candidates faster and move on, also known as failing fast. Having set the scene a little, I'll hand things over to our next presenter, Derek Gingery.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Certainly in digital health in the pharma world, it's hard to overlook the applications for real-world evidence. It's the potential to make clinical trials cheaper and more efficient and accessible. A lot of the drug industry is looking to digital health to collect this data from patients and hopefully use it to get applications approved. I'm going to give a basic definition of real-world evidence, look at some of the questions being asked, and discuss what's going to boost real-world evidence use. For those unfamiliar with the terms, real-world data is clinical information derived from sources such as electronic health records, insurance claims, registries, or mobile devices. Real-world evidence is clinical evidence on usage and potential benefits derived from analysis of real-world data. So you have the data, and then you have the evidence, and then the evidence is the analysis of that data to show whether a medical product has benefits. There is increased attention on the use of real-world evidence to help with drug development, including to support approval, especially now that the FDA is beginning to outline how it could be done. Many applications have been approved using real-world evidence, including several in the ultra-orphan space, and many more are being submitted. The agency released a framework in December 2018 on using data generated outside a clinical trial to demonstrate efficacy. The framework states 3 factors it will consider when evaluating real-world evidence: whether the data are fit for use, whether the trial or study design can provide adequate scientific evidence to answer or help answer a regulatory question, and whether study conduct meets regulatory requirements. The agency also issued guidance in May suggesting sponsors alert the agency when real-world evidence elements will be in an application, in part so they can track them and ensure that they are reviewed by the necessary experts. But at this point, there still is some uncertainty about the use of real-world evidence. Sponsors have asked many questions, and several are skittish. There are statistical questions like how to characterize missing data and where to find reliable sources for death statistics. Sponsors and others interested in the field continue to wait for more help from the FDA. They are looking at approval packages and other documents as well as guidances for clues on how the agency will handle real-world evidence in an application. Agency officials, including Principal Deputy Commissioner Amy Abernathy, who came to the agency from a real-world evidence-focused company called Flatiron Health, admitted recently that she is cautious about the use of real-world evidence at this point. Abernathy, who's pictured here speaking at a recent industry conference, said that the field is not quite ready to support a rolling mass placebo arm in a clinical trial, which is considered the holy grail for reducing development costs. Office of New Drugs Director Peter Stein also has said that believability and robustness of data are a concern. In addition, Bob Temple, one of the FDA's most knowledgeable clinical trial experts, said recently that he found real-world evidence to be very frustrating when it is intended to support efficacy claims, especially when epidemiological studies are involved. If you look at some of the approvals that have used real-world evidence, many of them involved historical or external controls or derived data from case reports and expanded access protocols. FDA assessors have expressed hesitation about the quality and utility of the real-world evidence submitted, and in some cases dismissed it when considering the actual regulatory decision. Experts suggest thinking about real-world data in a randomized controlled trial mindset. Ensure the data avoid issues like selection bias and that analyses do not include strong confounders. Both of these have led to questions from agency staff during an assessment. The goal is to remove as much variability as possible. However, the FDA continues to work on a number of projects that may be able to illustrate the value of real-world evidence. Several clinical trial replication projects are underway where groups are taking claims data to see if it will mirror randomized clinical trial results. If so, it could provide support for using real-world data to support drug approval. FDA said recently that a few were just completed, although results are not yet available. The agency also recently announced a collaboration between it, the Critical Path Institute, and the National Organization for Rare Disorders to create a platform to house, standardize, and aggregate patient-level natural history and other data for multiple rare diseases. The Rare Disease Cures Accelerator is accepting data now and will be available for research and other purposes. The agency also recently unveiled its My Studies mobile app, which can be used by sponsors to collect real-world data about medication use and other health issues in real time. The app is a web-based tool that can be used to design questionnaires and other material, and patient responses are securely stored so they can be used for research. The FDA made the app open source and made technical documents public to ensure widespread use. The agency also is in the midst of expanding its Sentinel program, which uses claims and other data to detect safety signals. Among the new units envisioned is a real-world evidence test bed known as FDA Catalyst. The FDA also expects to use Sentinel for real-world evidence trials and studies of product effectiveness. In addition, the FDA plans internal training for those who will encounter real-world evidence in applications. An internal FDA committee also is active that will ensure real-world evidence applications are handled the same way throughout the various divisions. And the FDA also is trying to understand how real-world evidence studies would meet regulatory needs and will offer sponsors comments on study designs. Ultimately, it appears the FDA may have to lead on the exploration of real-world evidence, but agency officials have been adamant that sponsors just need to try it by running pilot projects and build the case that it may work. Abernathy said pilot projects are not a bad thing and that the agency needs living examples to determine what works and what doesn't. So as Nike says, just do it. Now over to Zach.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. My name is Zach Rothstein, and I'm Vice President in the Technology and Regulatory Affairs Department at AdvaMed. AdvaMed stands for the Advanced Medical Technology Association, and we represent over 400 medical device manufacturers that are at all stages of product development. My particular areas of expertise include the FDA regulation of digital health products, and that's what I'll spend a few minutes talking about. So the U.S. FDA has spent the better part of this decade developing a very robust set of digital health policies using primarily what it calls guidance documents. Guidance documents do not have the same force as a rule or legislation, but it does express the agency's understanding of their current regulatory oversight of a particular product. Beginning in 2015, the agency issued what was called at that time the Mobile Medical Apps Guidance Document. And that guidance really laid the foundation for FDA's thinking over the last 5 years about how to regulate various digital health products. At the time, the guidance, the Mobile Medical Apps Guidance, was focused primarily on what it says, which is mobile medical apps. So really an app that would run on a mobile device, whether it was a phone or a watch or some other type of wearable. It provides a lot of background in terms of how to determine whether or not the product would be subject to FDA oversight. Moving from that guidance, FDA then transitioned into other areas to identify other types of software that may or may not be regulated by the agency. So in 2016, the General Wellness Guidance described what FDA calls general wellness products that would be outside of the scope of the FDA's jurisdiction. Now, recently, FDA has moved beyond just trying to figure out or defining for industry what products would be regulated by FDA versus those that would not, and instead is also spending time on actually how to regulate those digital health products that do meet the definition of a medical device and for which the agency exercises its enforcement over. So, for example, the Software Modifications Guidance document that was issued in 2017 does not discuss whether or not the product is actually subject to FDA jurisdiction. It is assumed at that point that it already is. That guidance talks about specifically what type of changes can be made to a particular software in the post-market environment before having to go back to FDA for a new clearance or approval. It's an important topic because software in particular can be changed quite rapidly at any time, and sometimes it's quite necessary to do so for various reasons. I will talk a little bit about cybersecurity on the next slide, and for example, you might have software that requires a patch due to the emergence of a new potential vulnerability. And so what FDA has said in the guidance on software modifications, for example, is that in the case of patching software due to cybersecurity concerns, you can do so without going to FDA. However, there are situations in which substantial changes to the underlying software outside of a cybersecurity context could require future FDA review. Most recently this year, in 2019, the FDA also discussed a potential approach to artificial intelligence. And again, I'll talk more about some other AI work in a slide two from this one. But suffice it to say, for purposes of this slide, the agency continues to evolve its thinking on artificial intelligence and also clinical decision support. Clinical decision support software is software that assists either a physician, other healthcare provider, or even a caregiver or the patient itself with specific actionable recommendations. FDA continues to evolve its thinking around this topic. This year, it actually issued a revised draft version of the clinical decision support guidance. So the first or the most recent draft that we saw as an industry came out in 2017. The docket was quite extensive on that particular guidance, and now we have another draft that's in a far different form than the previous version that is open for public comment. Moving into the cybersecurity space, it's an area that FDA has also spent the better part of a decade focusing on. Cybersecurity continues to be a major consideration across the entire healthcare ecosystem, and all players within that ecosystem are working together to address the issue. So when I say, the ecosystem, it includes everybody from the medical device manufacturer to the providers and the hospitals and the supply chain participants. Cybersecurity truly is a shared responsibility, and FDA has said as much in several of its public announcements. In particular, what FDA has done over the last 5 years or so is issued 2 guidance documents that deal with what industry must follow on the cybersecurity front to be compliant with FDA's requirements. So in 2014, FDA issued a pre-market submission guidance. And what this guidance did was lay out in the pre-market submission phase what type of documentation would need to be submitted to the agency to demonstrate that cybersecurity considerations have been undertaken in the development of the particular medical device. Now, that guidance has actually been revised, and a new draft of it was issued earlier this year. The docket has been closed for now some time, and FDA will likely issue a final version of this revised pre-market guidance in the coming months. FDA also issued in 2016 a post-market management cybersecurity guidance. Now, what this guidance deals with is once you have a product in the market, how do you deal with the potential cybersecurity issues that might arise? I mentioned in the last slide that as far as updating the product with a cybersecurity patch is concerned, further FDA review is not necessary. But this guidance goes further. It also identifies other areas that companies have to think about in the post-market realm when it comes to cybersecurity. So this could be something like how to issue or decide when to issue safety communications. It also recommends that companies participate in information sharing bodies. Now, an information sharing body is typically a private, confidentially and secured environment in which the participants can share intelligence about potential and active cybersecurity threats. So, for example, AVIMED, the association that I work for, we host what's called an ISAO, Information Sharing and Analysis Organization, and that provides our members a safe and secure environment to share cybersecurity threat information. Others exist beyond just ours. There's also, at the high level within the healthcare industry, an organization called the Healthcare ISAC, which stands for Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And the Healthcare ISAC coordinates that type of sharing beyond just the medical device manufacturers, but also with the healthcare provider community, supply chain vendors, and then also it runs up the chain into the Department of Homeland Security and HHS. So it's a large community approach when it comes to information sharing. And to tie that back real quick for you on the post-market guidance that FDA issued, what FDA said was to incentivize medical device companies to participate in one of these information sharing bodies. By participating in one, you would then have the ability to avoid certain types of post-market reporting directly to FDA. And so it's a bit of a carrot that FDA throws out there. Many medical device companies now do participate in one form or another of an information sharing body, really because the intelligence that they can gather through them can be very critical to their products. And the last slide that I have to share with you at this time is on artificial intelligence. I mentioned, earlier in my presentation that FDA issued a document this year on AI, and what that guidance talks about is a potential approach for FDA to take to allow artificial intelligence software to exist in the post-market environment and continue to update autonomously on its own without the need to go back to FDA. So in today's environment, when artificial intelligence is brought before an FDA review team, that algorithm that developed the underlying software would have to be what's called locked, or otherwise put into a static state, because FDA then has to review the algorithm, the outputs, and approve the product to go into the post-market environment. What that means is that in the post-market environment, the AI would not be able to update autonomously on its own under the current rule system. So what FDA is proposing through this discussion paper is that during the pre-market review, the manufacturer would work with the FDA review staff to develop what's called a change protocol, meaning that the two groups would talk about parameters in which the software could autonomously change itself within without the need for further FDA review. It's certainly a good approach from the industry's perspective and a good first start. It is just a discussion paper at this time, so it does not have any force yet, but there are certainly other aspects of the AI piece that FDA will continue to think about and that they need to address. And that includes, for example, on the pre-market submission side, how does FDA even review an AI-based algorithm if it is intended to change dynamically in the post-market environment, at that initial stage. And I've also included on this slide just a couple other references for you to think about. AI is a very large topic in the healthcare community. It's another, kind of a team approach that the industry is taking. So the Xavier University AI initiative is one example where the device industry, the pharmaceutical industry, representatives from the federal government, and others, including those in academia, are working together on various elements of AI in healthcare. The American Medical Association has also done a tremendous amount of work in this area to help its members, which are physicians, in terms of understanding and being able to apply AI in the field. And so this is an area of continuing evolution, and I think there's a lot still that we'll see in the coming years from both FDA and the industry in general. So with that, I'll pause and turn it over to Danny, who will take over for the rest of the presentation.
Sorry about that. I had to try to unmute my mic. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks, Zach, for taking the time to talk with everybody about what is happening in the digital health space, in particular when it comes to medical devices. As was mentioned earlier, my name is Danny. I'm a senior reporter for MedTech Insight. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of balls moving and in the digital health space, and trying to figure out what to kind of keep your eye on is one of the challenges I face as a reporter. So I want to talk about maybe the issue that is most interesting to me right now, and that's the FDA's pre-certification program. There's a lot of eagerness in the industry to see where this goes. So to give you a little background, I think Zach touched on it a little. In March 2017, the Center for Device and Radiological Health Associate Director of Digital Health, Bakul Patel, first publicly asked industry to envision what he called a pre-check program for digital health products. And this was mentioned at the AdvaMed MedTech conference in San Francisco or San Jose. I can't remember. I think it was San Francisco. And he likened it to TSA's pre-check program, where sponsors could go, through a separate line, essentially, based on the trust that FDA puts on them after they've gone through some sort of vetting process to show that they do have good systems in place to ensure that their products meet a certain quality standard. And so, this goes back to kind of understanding what FDA does. FDA's mission is to ensure that safe and efficacious products are allowed on the market. So they're the ones ensuring that public safety mission. So initially, the idea moved quite rapidly. Within 6 months after the conference, FDA announced it had selected 9 companies, including some big ones like Verily, which is basically Google, Samsung, and then J&J and Roche to participate in a pilot program aimed at gathering information to develop this pre-cert program. And then about 6 months after that, Bakul Patel and his team brought together a wide range of stakeholders at the National Institute of Health in D.C. for a 2-day meeting to try to define what evaluating a company's excellence means. So they had to be realistic in terms of information that they could gather from companies without putting too much burden on them or compromising their intellectual property. And so various stakeholders, including manufacturers, academics, researchers, they all kind of got together in these really deep discussions that then FDA took notice of and helped build this pre-cert program. So the agency basically spent the rest of the year working with the pilot participants and based on the feedback from the NIH meeting to come up with an initial working model that they released in April 2018. Since then, however, it seems like things have gotten a little slower as FDA is continuously trying to gather more information and trying to understand what they can do, because there is some challenges here because, as I said, FDA's mission is about safety and efficacy, and FDA is supposed to review all these products that come through its pipeline. But, here what it's basically saying is that it's going to allow a little bit more leeway and let the companies basically get these products on the market with some minimal review from FDA. So they're trying to find that right balance to try to allow these products on the market because they do believe that, trying to get these products on the market will benefit patients. But at the same time, they want to make sure they're not losing the sight of, their mission, which is that they get to review these products for safety and efficacy. So the latest development that we've seen from the pre-cert program is that they issued a mid-year review this summer where they basically said, yes, evaluating manufacturer practices can be sufficient to letting products on the market. So we'll see where that leads. But right now what FDA is saying is their initial review says that they can just evaluate the company, and based on that, that'll allow them to get products on the market, because what they've been doing is kind of like a parallel review of the products that potentially could come to market, and also at the same time reviewing the companies themselves, and they find there is a correlation in terms of the quality of the product and the I would say corporate soundness of these companies. So that kind of sums up what the pre-cert program is doing right now. I want to step into another issue, which is all the legal concerns around what is happening with digital health products. So one of the most important questions that is being asked about the pre-cert program is, does FDA have that legal authority to go ahead with a program? Because FDA has a lot of ambitions to where it wants the program to go. The folks at FDA believe that they can minimize use of their resources and resources of various sponsors to get their products on market if they use the pre-cert program, because otherwise, every time a product goes to market, it would have to go through the de novo program or the 510K or something like that, and that can take a lot of time. And especially, I think what Zach alluded to earlier is, you've got these programs, these what FDA calls software as a medical device, or SAMDs, And if you're dealing with these SAMDs, which can update themselves, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, unlike other medical device products, which can take, every couple of years to update, if you're dealing with that kind of a rapid, updating, you can't really ask the medical device makers to keep coming back and having to, file another 510K for their product, because what that would mean is basically they would get backlogged, and you would, have, an updated program maybe 6 months or a year after the updates happen, and by that time, there's been maybe 10, 20 iterations of that program. So that's the kind of conundrum that FDA is facing right now, and that's why they had the pre-cert program, and that's raised concerns about, whether FDA has the authority to do that. And then while FDA says it's working within its statute, FDA basically says that the pre-cert program is something that is working within its statutory authority, and plans to launch the program after it's fully, reviewed it. But some stakeholders are saying, experts are saying that it may need congressional authority, additional congressional authority to make it happen, but we'll see what happens. So talking to the FDA, the agency isn't denying the fact it may need more congressional authority, though. But right now, its focus is to try to get the program off the ground based on the authority that it has. What I found recently interesting is CBRA's director, Jeff Shuren, was at the MedTech conference, which is hosted by AdvaMed this year. It was in Boston. And he mentioned that maybe it's time for FDA to kind of reconsider its statutory authorities, because whenever new technology comes to market, FDA has to go back to Congress and ask for new authorities to try to get that product on market. And instead, what he says is maybe the industry and FDA and others should start thinking about something called what he called the regulatory Legos. So instead of having to keep going back to Congress and keep having to get new legislative authority to try to get products on the market, FDA would have more of a broader authority to mold its regulatory system to get those products on the market. He didn't provide a lot of details into what that could mean in his view, but he did say that the current process where FDA has to keep going back to Congress for more regulatory authorities to keep up with new technology is inefficient, and instead it should have those broader authorities that would allow products to develop faster and get to market sooner. And in talking about regulatory Legos idea, he also, in particular, mentioned the pre-cert program, which I thought was interesting, because the FDA has been constantly saying that we're going to get this product off the ground based on our statutory authorities, but kind of alluded to the idea that maybe even Jeff Shuren is thinking that they will need additional congressional authority to fully realize the pre-cert program. But that's me as a reporter just thinking that way. But we'll see what happens. The bottom line is it seems like FDA is not quite equipped right now to handle the new types of medtech technology, especially in the digital health space that are rapidly evolving. A couple of other stakeholders in the digital health arena should also have taken notice about privacy laws, because when you're dealing with digital health, a lot of times what you're doing is you're dealing with patient data, and especially when it comes to things such as the Health Insurance Privacy and Portability Act, or HIPAA, you can have certain liability issues that come into play. And then you've also got, as Zach kind of talked about, the cybersecurity issue surrounding that. So talking a little about HIPAA, on the topic of HIPAA, a lot of digital health technology products, as I said, take in large amounts of patient health data to make diagnostic decisions, such as clinical decision support software, or CDS, again, as Zach mentioned, and that use and sometimes they might use artificial intelligence or machine learning to provide some sort of diagnostic answer. Some of these products, such as certain continuous glucose meters, collect patient data, store it in the cloud, and then share it with healthcare providers. In those situations, it's important for everyone involved to understand where their responsibilities lie in protecting the patient's health data. So that kind of situation can mean that there's divided responsibility between the patient and the manufacturer and the physician to ensure that there's no violation of that health data. So when you're dealing with the digital health technology, you're also often working with connected devices that are able to transfer information and commands between systems. Again, in such cases, it's important to understand who has what ability for the cybersecurity of the product. So if you have more than one stakeholder providing the device to patients, say for instance, the medical device manufacturer in a hospital system, it's important to contractually delineate the responsibility, especially when something goes wrong. Right now, it seems when an attack happens, there seems to be a lot of finger pointing between the stakeholders to try to shrug off responsibility. Manufacturers, will argue that hospital needs to take more responsibility for the device because the devices are too old and the networks aren't secure enough. The hospitals, on the other hand, will say that it should be the manufacturers who should take responsibility for ensuring that the devices are patched and are secure to operate. So, when you're getting into that kind of a relationship, whether you're a hospital or a manufacturer or a third-party vendor, it's really, really important to try to figure out, if something bad happens, who bears responsibility. So, so try to figure that out. And also going back to the HIPAA issue that also again makes is part of that consideration because protecting that patient data may not just be one person's responsibility, but a shared responsibility. So that's kind of some of the legal concerns that we've kind of come across as we've dealt with all of this. I want to kind of step into the next thing is what can we expect with the digital health space moving forward. So it's important to remember there are certain digital health consumer or wellness products that have exploded on the market, and then there are digital health medical devices. So FDA, as Zach kind of mentioned, has put out a bunch of guidances on this, trying to help companies and the industry in general understand what is considered a medical device that the agency will regulate, what is a medical device that the agency will use its discretionary authority to not regulate, and then what is considered like a wellness device that the agency will not even bother looking at. So there's kind of this, it's tried to explain that, but the problem is, while it's tried to make it clear through these guidances, there's still a lot of gray zone left. So, a lot of times when I go to these conferences, the big question is my device going to be regulated by FDA? And people just can't seem to find a clear answer. And I think FDA, with some of the later, more recent guidances, has tried to clarify that. But I don't think even FDA often knows really whether it needs to regulate a device or not until it actually sees the device. The consistent issue since FDA put out its risk-based mHealth guidances a few years ago is this whole idea behind whether a device is a wellness product, whether it's a medical device that the agency will not regulate, or whether it's a device that it will regulate based on this risk-based approach. To try to bring more clarity, it has issued new guidances, and we will probably see more guidances in various areas of digital health, where the agency tries to outline what it will and won't regulate. An interesting issue the agency has tried to, an interesting thing that we've written about in the past is companies are often advised to get consumer-grade version of their product to market first, and then after collecting data on the product, use that information to file an application with FDA to ensure that they start generating some revenue so that they have a stream of revenue paying for the product, and then or B, they can collect that data so that they can either inform their clinical trials or it can be used in a clinical trial. I've started to see some companies, however, buck the idea and are going straight to FDA and trying to get regulated medical devices to the market right away so that they can be the first through the gate. So I think that's really interesting that we're seeing more of that. And actually, FDA would like to see more of that as well. Talking to FDA regulators, one of the big issues that they seem to raise is that, yes, there are all these really cool wellness products, there are all these cool wearable technology it's going to revolutionize, how we take care of patients. But at the end of the day, they're not validated. And when you have unvalidated products, you can't really use them in clinical trials. You can't really use them in a lot of situations where you'd want to use them, because you need to be able to verify that the data that they're picking up is accurate. And I think a lot of people who develop, let's say, heart rhythm monitors on watches will attest to that, because we've seen the reports that there's a disparity between the different watches. Even though they're getting better and better by the day, there is a concern that there is still a lot of difference between how accurate those devices are. So for that reason, I think FDA is looking forward to the future where we do have validated wellness products and devices that can be used in clinical trials. So whether you're making a consumer wellness product or an FDA-regulated medical device, intellectual property protection in digital health space can be really fuzzy. A few years ago, you may have heard of this case called Alice Corporation versus CLS Bank. It was a case that, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the case, but basically the Supreme Court in that case set a test for what is and isn't patentable subject matter. In short, the ruling essentially stated that if you're doing what is considered taking a natural process and running it through a computer, then it's not patentable. So based on this, the advice that I've heard from experts is that companies need to focus on patentability of their hardware over the software, because it's easier to patent your hardware. But that being said, the courts are starting to swing back from Alice on this subject, and there's ongoing efforts in Congress to give software makers more leverage to patent their programs. There's been a couple of bills that we've been kind of following, and I can go if they do pass, would mean more protection for software manufacturers. Another important area to look out for when it comes to digital health is reimbursement. As Zach and folks at AdvaMed will say, one of the problems in general in the medical device industry that they've faced is that there's something called the valley of death. So whenever they get their product, approved or cleared, that's great. It's ready to go on the market, but then no one wants to pay for it. So they had this problem with getting the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services to try to give them codes so that they can start getting paid for those products. And so reimbursement has traditionally been a difficult hurdle for the medical device industry in general, as I've alluded to, but especially when you have new technology such as digital health products, it's even more difficult to get the government and private payers to pay for them. In some cases, when it comes to wellness products that ensure patients change their behavior to improve their health, some companies have actually gone directly to the employers and said, our product will improve your workers' health, and that'll help reduce your health insurance burdens. So, buy our product, and companies have been doing that. So that's an interesting development where they've kind of circumvented the traditional government and private payer system, and they're trying to get their products on the market that way. There is hope, however, for digital health and other medical device companies. CMS has been working on some rule changes, that AdvaMed has been a part of, that Zach can maybe even talk about, that would allow products to get on the market that's contingent on ensuring that they produce the results that they claim to in the long term. And if they don't, then CMS has the ability to pull that product off the market. So that's kind of some of the things that, we can kind of look forward to as the digital health space evolves. With that said, I'd encourage you folks, I'm going to make a shameless plug to keep following MedTech Insight. We've been covering this for a long time, and it's a really interesting area. And I think when it comes to the pre-cert program, we were the first to actually write and report about it. So if you want more details, a lot of it is in our reporting. With that, I'm going to give it back to Lucy. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Danny. Some great discussion points from all of our speakers. We now have time for a Q&A session. A few of you have already submitted questions, so we're going to jump right in. If you find a cybersecurity vulnerability on your product or have been hacked, what should you do? Perhaps that's one for you, Zach.
Yeah, happy to take the first shot at answering this question. So there's a couple steps that you have to do. So at least under the U.S. FDA's rules, we have something called the Quality System Regulation, and that regulation deals with all matters of risk in the post-market environment. And so the post-market cybersecurity guidance that I mentioned is actually a further explanation of how that quality system regulation applies in the context of cybersecurity specifically, because cybersecurity is a risk that a medical device might face. So in the case that a vulnerability is discovered on your product, or you otherwise believe that the device has been hacked, there are a couple of things. So obviously first, internally, there should be teams in place that deal with that hack, and that's more of a business operational kind of move. And then the next step is to speak with the regulators, because in some cases a public communication might need to be made based on what the issue is and what the nature of the fix might be. And then the third piece is typically you would then develop a patch or other type of fix to this discovered issue and issue it to the public. And so that would go through, in most cases we've seen, it looks more like a recall notice where the announcement is made like a recall, and companies would issue a patch either through their website or through their distributor network. So that's typically how companies would address it. I will note, just for purposes of this question, vulnerabilities have been discovered. There are instances in which medical device companies have issued these recall notices for a cybersecurity vulnerability. We are not aware as an industry right now of any medical device being maliciously hacked in the real world. So that's something that we don't have experience directly with in terms of how that would work.
We have today, what are the key technical barriers preventing the best use of real-world evidence?
It's hard to say from a technical standpoint. I'm not going to profess to be like the person that designs the trials and everything, but I think it's just a general. There's a lot of just general kind of just concern, is what we've heard, just where people don't know how the FDA is going to react to this, and part of that is because there just isn't a lot of experience. There's some experience in the orphan space and some other areas with real-world evidence, but again, you hear FDA officials talking about this isn't ready for prime time yet. We really, we need to see some more use cases, and no one really wants to be kind of the guinea pig, I guess, for lack of a better term. So I think it's just a matter of, I don't know about the technical issues. I think it's mainly companies are a little unsure, if they do it, how whether it's going to sit well with FDA.
What's been the experience getting digital health products reviewed by the FDA?
So I think the thing is, all these technologies are so new that a lot of times when you're picking a pathway to try to get these products approved, typically you end up coming down to the de novo pathway, maybe the 510K pathway, if you can point to something else. But, the interesting thing, is that, just giving an example. So, typically, and Zach, correct me if I'm wrong on this, the de novo pathway will take about, 6 months to, I think, 9 months or something like that to get a product through. Apple was able to do that with their Apple Watch within 30 days, which I think a lot of people were very surprised by. And so, FDA has this whole policy. You're not allowed to look at the data before it happens, or like the detailed data. You can look at kind of like the general stuff, I guess. At least that's what FDA says. So when you're trying to get these products through market, you have to kind of strategically figure out, okay, what does FDA want? How do we present this data? And in order to do that, the recommendation is to take full advantage of FDA's pre-submission, or what they call the Q-sub process, where you can set up meetings with FDA prior to giving them your information to talk about, okay, here's kind of the product that we're developing. This is what our plan is. What do you guys need from us? So if you do that right, and I think Apple did that, plus the person who submitted I forget her name, but the person who submitted the application to FDA on behalf of Apple was a former FDA reviewer, one of their top reviewers. So she knew exactly what she was doing. She knew exactly what FDA needed. And so when FDA got all that data, they were easily able to go through that and be like, okay, this looks good. One of the other important things is, what is the risk level of that device? So, I mean, if this is a device or a software or a SAMD that is being regulated by FDA, based on that risk level, FDA may require more time to look it over. So those are kind of some of the factors. But typically, if you're looking at something like a de novo, Apple, I think, is a bit of an anomaly. You should probably expect something at least 6 months before you'll get any sort of response from FDA. Zach, do you have anything to add to that?
So, Danny, I think, that was a really good response, and just the Apple piece of this. I don't know by, any firsthand knowledge here, but my guess is that based on some reports about Apple and communications with FDA that date back to the mid, 2010s, so like 2015, 2016, Apple was already meeting with FDA. So my guess is that probably like many other companies, they were already providing FDA with a lot of data and information during either an official Q-sub meeting or just, in some other type of informal setting. So I think that 30 days is probably a bit arbitrary in terms of what the process really looked like for Apple. I think, it's probably safe to say it was a much longer process. It was just the official clock only went for about 30 days. But, kind of zooming out to the broader picture of getting software through FDA's process, we represent a lot of companies, and the timelines that are associated with the 510K or de novo for software, right now we're not hearing that that's terribly problematic. So, while Pre-Cert is envisioning a potentially new pathway that would obviously have the potential to speed up the pre-market process, I'm not sure that's the only thing that would need to be, a driving factor to change the regulatory regime we have. I think what Pre-Cert's really looking at is how do you make it more suitable to the type of product we have, and that's where the benefits really start to emerge. But, yeah, I mean, I think in general, companies that are going through the FDA process, they are working the process. It's going just fine. And like Danny said, the pre-submission process is a key part of ensuring that, the data you give to the review team is what they expect, what they want, and what they need.
Another question we have. Can you expand on the statistical issues with real-world evidence that have been raised and must be dealt with?
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting little thing for those of us in the room who are wonky. With a traditional clinical trial, the missing data is very clearly defined. It's data that's supposed to be there, but it's not. So FDA has a set of procedures that they follow or can follow when that occurs. But with real-world evidence, it's been brought up that that you might collect this data, or you might have this data, and items might not be there, but it's not because they were supposed to be collected and they weren't. So it's just not there. So how do you account? And the question is, how do you account for that? Do you how do you design the clinical trial? How do you look at how do you do some of the statistical modeling and issues that go along with that? It's not as simple as saying it's missing, because it's technically not, quote, missing in the classical sense. So that's something that statisticians, as they, and academics are still kind of chewing on in terms of how this will be handled going forward. Especially since with real-world evidence, all the data that you see is not always exactly the same, as you go along, as you're putting it all together. As far as death data, and this is one that just it surprised me when I first heard it, and I continue to be surprised about it. Is that there isn't a really reliable place to get death data. Like, people look all over the place. Like, they look at obituaries online. There's like national databases, but the problem is that in an electronic medical record, usually the patient's death is not put in there. So, especially in diseases like cancer, where you're trying to figure out, like the survival rates and things like that, not knowing the patient's death if they died is a big problem. And there is a national death index, which is really good apparently, but it's slow. That the data is slow to aggregate. It's usually about a year or more behind, and that's a problem for clinical trials. So this is something else that they're just kind of wrestling with. How do we? It just affects how real world evidence trials and these issues are going to be dealt with going forward.
I'm afraid we've run out of time for any further questions today. I'd like to thank our speakers, Derek, Zach, Danny, for their great presentations. If you have submitted questions and we haven't got back to them, we will follow up at email. On behalf of the Pharma Intelligence team, we hope you've enjoyed this webinar.